I was a bit worried about whether I had enough stuff to talk about, so I persuaded Robin to cut the length of time that my presentation would last. But I may have overdone that now, since we're 10 minutes late starting. So I'm going to have to go quickly. So I'm Steve Yearley, and as of today, I'm in ISSTI properly. Until last Friday, I was director of the Genomics Forum, but the Genomics Forum is no more. And I don't even have kind of a badge slides anymore. I used to make sure I had to do things on the Genomics Network slides, and big thank you to the SLC at the end, but now I'm free and independent. Now this talk is really about the sociology and politics of monitoring, and it was intended to be given by me and Eugénia Rodrigues, who many of you will know. Eugénia had a blue screen of death incident on her laptop, and was told by information services that they might be able to save it if she got it to them this afternoon. So she's gone to the laptop clinic instead of coming here. So that's where she is. We wrote this together, and she would have been doing most of the first part. So excuse me if I make a bit of a mess of it. Okay, so we've got a so no logo. So this is about politics and monitoring, and we've got a menu. So what we've done here is it's in 3 sections, one of which, as I said, Eugénia would have been leading on. So about the sociology of monitoring and how we think about these issues about the role of monitoring, particularly in environmental topics. And then I want to say something about the politics and monitoring project, which we're just starting, that involves Graham over there. And then our component of this is about monitoring climate emissions and climate change in the UK. Now we've got this colour-coded the menu. So the first section, as you'll see now, is sort of unattractive, flashy pink. It looks better on the screen at home. So everything that's pink is about the first bit, then it goes green, then it goes grey. Okay, so there's a kind of countdown involved in that. Now, the other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that the letters are kind of big. They're a bit painful for me to read, actually, from here. So I might give the talk from the back, or maybe up in the enclosure. So I shrunk them down to try to make it smaller, because I thought we were going to have a normal, small screen, but in fact, this is the size of several gorillas. So it's a bit big, okay? Put your glasses on. Okay, so this section is about sociology of monitoring. And as I said, this is a lot of this stems from Eugénia's work and work we've done together. And really got 2 short aims within this section. So to say something about how central environmental monitoring, in fact, is to many forms of environmental concern and intervention. And also to say what's interesting about monitoring from an STS kind of position, although I guess in some ways it's more obvious to an audience like this than it has been to other kinds of audiences. So the first thing then is about the centrality of monitoring. So our feeling is that in a whole lot of environmental issues about environmental concern, particularly in the kind of language of environmental risk, that followed the worldwide success of Beck's book, where people began to rethink environmental issues as really issues about risk. There was a lot of focus on the problem, or there was a lot of focus on the risk, but there wasn't much focus on how we know what the problem is, or how we know the extent of the issue. So if we think of something like risk, so let's take, I don't think all environmental problems really are risks, but if we think of a lot of environmental problems as things you can reframe as a kind of risk, well then it seems to us, I may say me occasionally, so I just forget. So it seems to us that environmental risks are logically and empirically very closely tied to monitoring. So, I mean, there's been a lot of argument, big public falling out, about the safety of underground storage of nuclear waste, for example. So you've got this nuclear waste on the surface of Sellafield, you want to figure out what to do with it, well, maybe you bury it underground. Now, there's a whole lot of discussion around the risk of that, but the whole point of burying it is to get it away from people. And unless you have some way of monitoring it, you can't very realistically talk about what the risks are. So, in nearly every case where you can think of, an environmental claim being couched as a risk, there's a question about, well, how do you know what the risk is unless you're monitoring the thing which allegedly gives rise to the risk? So monitoring and risks are very closely tied in a logical sense. But there's also a kind of an additional empirical sense that will be very familiar from an STS point of view, which is that, of course, the actual safety of any disposal depends on how carefully and scrupulously the people carrying out the routines. So, we've known from the sociology of risk literature for 20 or 30 years that you often get these generalized accounts of how risky something is, but the actual day-to-day risk or the actual risk in a particular site depends on how conscientiously the facility is run, how carefully protocols are followed, and so on. So there's a tendency to rewrite these things as about risks, but I think risks entail monitoring, both in a logical sense that you wouldn't know what the risk was unless you monitored it, and also in that broader sort of social dimension that there's this issue of, the actual danger of the risk depends on how things are managed. So the establishing and management of risks, we think, is nearly always tied to practices of monitoring. Without environmental monitoring, it doesn't make much sense to have risk calculations. And the irony is that, particularly in sociology, I think, maybe less in STS, but in sociology, that nearly all the sociological attention is focused on the risks, and more or less none on the monitoring. I mean, if you say, who writes on the sociology of monitoring? Well, there aren't many people apart from sort of surveillance kind of monitoring, which I'll get onto in a second. Now, this isn't, so I've talked about risk, but it isn't only about risk, because it turns out a lot of other environmental claims depend centrally on monitoring as well. So, to give a couple of fairly recent but sort of topical examples, it turns out that a lot of things that we suppose that we know about biodiversity and causes of species loss, also we haven't really had the monitoring evidence around. So there's been this recent stuff popularised by the BBC around cuckoos. Cuckoos come here and then they go back somewhere. But where exactly they go on the way back there was very little known until recently. So if you were concerned about biodiversity conservation with respect to cuckoos, well, you could do a lot for them here, but then they would bugger off and you wouldn't know how to help them because you wouldn't know exactly where they were. And then similarly, there's been a whole question about bees and neonicotinoids and varroa and so on. And of course, a big part of that is, well, where do bees go? But until recently, you couldn't make the radio devices that would send positioning information small enough for a bee to be able to carry. So you put them on and then they'd crash. And then you said, well, they don't go very far. But maybe they don't go very far because they've got these fucking big antennae. So there are a lot of things where we need to know the stuff, but unless you're monitoring, you don't really know. There was a great accidental contribution to the study of the oceans that was created. Maybe some of you saw this. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was a bizarre accident in which a Chinese, or at least a Chinese rented boat that was carrying plastic ducks, little plastic ducks, for the UK market crashed, and the ducks were released. And this was initially a bit of a nuisance and an insurance claim, but then people realised this was a bit of an opportunity because these ducks, floated around. So then you had a kind of crowdsourcing activity where people were encouraged to send in the ducks that they found, and it turned into a kind of a novel mechanism for monitoring the world's oceans and where flows actually went, which is kind of important for the systems studies and for some of the stuff on climate change. And then, of course, obviously, there's stuff around climate. You can't really talk about climate issues without thinking about how these things are monitored. So how do we know? You get all these denialists focusing on, oh, it was a bit cold in May, and so on. But that issue of, well, what is the average temperature of the Earth? What does it mean for there to be an average temperature of the Earth? And how is that compiled out of all the observations? All the stuff about sea level rise. How do you monitor sea level? How do you know where the sea level is rising? Some interesting stuff recently on the gravitational, so if the Greenland ice sheet melts, we all know there's going to be more water in the seas. but one of the things that hasn't been much discussed is the fact that, well, there's going to be less gravitational attraction to the oceans from the ice that used to be on Greenland. So that the water around Greenland is projected to fall if the ice sheet melts, because of the loss of the gravitational pull from all the ice that was in the ice sheet. So you need all this monitoring if you're going to talk about a whole range of environmental problems. So we've argued that monitoring is conceptually and empirically key to environmental practice, and that generally speaking it's been overlooked in favour of risks. But maybe that's because it's so structural as to be trivial. Is there anything sociologically or STS interesting to say about this? Well, obviously it was a false question, I think there is. It's clearly the case that, from a STS lens, monitoring is a bit like observation. And of course, we've all been, whenever we read STS textbooks, from Moltke and Hansen and all those people back in the 60s and 70s, monitoring, looks like a kind of observation, and thus it's subject to all the complexities celebrated in the science studies literature around, well, we think of observation as just like seeing, but it isn't quite as plain as all that. And of course, a lot of seeing in the sciences is mediated through instruments and conventions and so on. So all of the things that you would say about observation, you can also kind of say about monitoring, that monitoring is, for example, theory-laden. So again, a very well-known example, but I think a very dramatic one, is that in early arguments over whether there might be ozone depletion, it turned out that the US detecting equipment was routinely finding a big hole in the ozone layer over the Antarctic, but was simply dismissing it because the depletion was so great that they just assumed that the airborne detection system wasn't working. So that they just said, well, no, that's a false positive, and they got rid of the data. So the ozone hole was detected much sooner than it was officially detected, but people just assumed it was a mistake. So it's kind of theory-laden. People assumed that it couldn't possibly have deteriorated this quickly, so there must be something wrong with the technology that was used to detect it. Now, of course, we know from the history of work on observation that there's a sense in which, and this goes, in some ways, is the heart of Chapin's point about virtual witnessing and so on, is that observation looks like a kind of democratic activity, because anybody can observe. In the court of law, this idea that, unless there's some obvious reason why you can't see the thing, like you're wearing blinds or you're a pirate with a choking your eye or something, that people can just see the same as each other. Of course, Chapin and Schaefer make the point that in the 17th century this was a very contestable issue about, well, who could you trust to see? Servants really couldn't be witnesses of their master's experiments, because of course they would say what their masters told them to say. So there's a long history of this, well, seeing is just plain seeing, but on the other hand we know it isn't, and there are special reasons for doubting that. And therefore, because it's just like seeing, people often think, well, monitoring provides a lot of scope for sort of upstreaming, for public engagement, that you can get volunteer corps of people involved in monitoring. And of course, to some extent, this does happen with, the kind of eye spot kind of idea in biodiversity, where people see or photograph things and send the records in, or where you get anglers trained to look out for river insects and so on. But people's observations are widely known to be corrigible. That is, they may make observations, but maybe they're not making them in quite the right sense. Now, this was set up to be a Portuguese joke, so it's not really going to work here. But in Portugal, there's a question about what colour are rivers. Well, rivers are supposed to be blue, but the River Sado is the only blue river in Portugal, or so it's said, because the others tend to be turbid and brown. So what colour is the river? Well, actually, it's brown. But children always draw rivers as blue because they know that canonically they're blue. So people often make, their recall of what they've seen is often coloured by what they know that things should look like, so that people's observations tend to be corrigible. not only are they corrigible, but they're open to certain kinds of interpretation, often tied up in routines and protocols. So when Eugénia in particular has looked at sort of community water management and community water sampling issues, so people have a very strong sense that their river is contaminated, but it's often difficult to turn that into something that will count as evidence for the Environment Agency or something, because you have to treat the water in a specific kind of way for that water then to count as evidence. You have to have it in certain kinds of amounts, in certain numbers of samples and so on. And of course, legal provisions often state that water contamination really, I mean, the thresholds depend on how long the pollution lasts. So something that looks bad but passes quickly may not actually count as a contravention of the regulations. So something that people may be very sure that they've seen may not count as that thing because it doesn't fulfill the legal obligations. So if we have the idea, well, on the face of it, observation, I mean, on the face of it, monitoring is a kind of a species of observation, and the observation is kind of easy because it's seen. We have these problems of theory-ladenness, interpretability, and corrigibility. So you might expect, I mean, nobody in this room, but anybody outside this room, might expect that direct monitoring would resolve issues. You know, that there's a problem, people go and have a look, and they say whether that's true or not. But for the reasons given above, interpretability and corrigibility and so on, it commonly doesn't. That people manage to continue to disagree even after they've seen the supposed observations or the supposed evidence. Indeed, environmental disputes can often turn into disputes over the observations. So the observations don't resolve the issue. In fact, observations just get embroiled in the dispute, and then you have arguments about what is the correct way to observe something. And of course, when you have citizen monitoring, you also get into these kind of problems that even if you manage to get a local group to be sure that something was what they saw, that may not convince people who've got alternative perspective or alternative interests around these things. Now, this was ideally set up for Trevor, although I didn't realise that Trevor was going to bring up the census. But one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that Beck in World Risk Society has this sort of beautifully Beckian kind of idea about the alienation of the senses. So he says, you know, that modern risks are different from old, lovely, cuddly kind of risks because the senses are alienated. So previously, if something was bad, then by and large, it sort of felt or smelt bad. Whereas modern risks, you can't sense them. You can't sense radioactive hazards. And the senses are devalued. But, I mean, you read that and you think, well, I mean, that's clever. And then you think, well, no, probably that isn't quite right, actually. Because it seems to me that the senses are still very much just in play. That although there are some things that we acknowledge are difficult to sense, other activities are actually still very dependent on people's sense-based sensorial observation of the environment. And you even get disputes between people who say, well, you know, the Environment Agency says this river isn't contaminated, but it looks contaminated or it smells odd to me. And one of the cases that Eugénia analysed was, again, a Portuguese initiative called Census at Watch, which I confusingly always call Swatch, but it isn't really that. It's Census at Watch. And Census at Watch was an attempt to, as it were, discipline people in their senses, to turn people into a kind of crowdsourced initiative for environmental monitoring. So the idea was that you would train people on how to detect chlorine in drinking water and particular kind of odours, and then they would be observation posts that are working 16 hours a day, sniffing the sleep. So that you could have a reinvigoration of the senses where monitoring is tied to the senses, despite, I think, what Beck says. So, that's one part of what makes monitoring interesting for sociologists, and you know, some of the stuff around a kind of naive expectation of monitoring not working out is because it's like observation, and we know that there are these problems with observation. But I think the other thing is that it's interestingly tied to sociological and political science concern about surveillance, and of course this ties into some of Nadia and Kate's interests in sort of biological surveillance as well. So Lion from Canada has a big focus on monitoring and its connection to surveillance. Now, one of the odd things with regard to the environment is that although you might think that in many cases we see monitoring as kind of the state's gaze and people want to resist it, often the call from community groups and environmental NGOs is for more and more extensive monitoring. You know, they really want to know what's going on about pollution or emissions or something of that sort. But you also, interestingly, more recently get development of monitoring as kind of self-disciplining. So the availability of, you can look up your carbon footprint. In fact, the university encourages us to do our carbon footprint, doesn't it? It sends you around a survey. Fortunately, I cycled here today, by the way, just in case the questionnaire came in. But I cycled to work today, so I have a 0 carbon footprint according to the university. But you have these daily ways to monitor your performance. So monitoring promotes self-conscious awareness, which I think is an interesting and potentially kind of empowering thing. But it may generate a form of obligation to use self-disciplining techniques. And then, then it becomes a bit like dieting. You've sort of got to do it, but you wish you didn't have to, and you come up with all these routines for resisting these things that you feel you're being hemmed into doing. So then you get monitoring's unintended consequences. So self-disciplining may not work out as intended. People may follow the disciplines erratically. And of course, as we know with the REF and the research assessment exercise and so on, that if you give people targets, well, they tend to produce more of whatever it is that's targeted, rather than whatever it was that the agency thought was going to underlie the target. So you had scandals until recently about councils being very keen on collecting material for recycling, but then not having any way of disposing it. So they have this big apparatus for meeting recycling targets, and then it would just go to landfill. Or you get the crazy thing of people importing biofuels and ignoring local production of stuff that could be burned. So you get this mismatch between what the monitoring is intended to promote and what it actually promotes. So the first part of the menu, which is the longest part, is to say that for us there's a real absence of a focus on monitoring. So if we go to Sociology and the Environment sessions of the International Sociological Association or whatever, there's lots of talks about risks and environmental problems, but there's very little focus on monitoring. Monitoring, I think, is a very interesting issue from an STS point of view. Now, Christina Boswell in politics in our school thinks so too, but she, as a political scientist, was more interested in the politics of monitoring, and we had a number of conversations about her ideas about monitoring. And we have this recent award, which is it's only been going for 6 weeks or something, so there's not much to tell you about except the ideas. But this involves Graham and Christina, as you'll see on this next slide. But for Christina and for us in the context of this award, monitoring is really about the practice of gathering and analysing information by state agencies or people concerned with the performance of state agencies to track policy problems and to measure the impact of policy interventions. So our assumption in this is that monitoring is central to the policy processes, and that policymakers, you make a policy, and then you need to know whether the policy is having the anticipated effect. So you need monitoring to gather that information, and also often to respond to others' claims, because pressure groups on newspapers or whoever, come to that in a second, will be monitoring your performance, and you need your data to counter their assertions. So we devised this idea for a study of the role of monitoring in the policy process, based around 3 case studies. So the title of the study is the policies of monitoring, information, indicators and targets in climate change defence and immigration policy. And so Christina is in charge of the immigration bit, Graham, assisted by Colin Fleming, is doing the defence, and Eugénia and I are doing the climate bit. And as I say, this is a 3-year project that started 2 months ago. Now, so just to give, before I say a bit more about the climate bit, I'll say a tiny bit about the immigration. I won't say anything about defence because Graham can answer questions about that if people have any. But immigration it's a kind of social fact, you know, that there are, you would think it would be a positivistic kind of thing. You know, there are these many people in the country and these many people have the right to be here by birth or by immigration status or whatever. But it's, as we know, a very difficult fact to actually get your handle on the truth. How many people are, so as somebody said they come as a tourist, but are they really a tourist? Somebody's come on a student visa to certain London universities, let's say, are they really students or are they something else? So although conceptually the status of how many people are immigrants or how many people are here as a result of the interaction of immigration and immigration, it's very difficult to get the handle on it. And of course, in this case, there's an important question of who is monitoring this and doing claims making about it. Well, obviously, the Home Office and the UK Border Agency are making claims about this, but much more enthusiastically, the Daily Mail and UKIP are making claims about these kind of things. So that you've got the sense here in which, well, you want monitoring because you've got a policy. David Cameron said something, and he's got a policy, and he's got to be seen to be doing something about that. He probably wants to be doing something about it as well, but that's probably the least of his concerns. The next most important thing is that he said he'd do something about it, so you've got to have a story about that. And also, there are lots of people out there who want him to do something about it, and will give him a bad time if he doesn't. Now, the thing which I think is interestingly different from between the immigration case and the climate case is that both of them are, as it were, at heart, they're kind of facts. Maybe difficult to get a handle on, but they're, in principle, they're sort of facts. But the consequences or the impacts of climate change are thought about largely in terms of their consequences. So what might be the impact on agriculture, or what might be the impact on disease, or these kinds of things. So the concerns in the climate case are nearly all consequentialist ones. Whereas, of course, in the immigration case, you do have consequentialist claims about, well, what is the consequences for the social security bill, what happens to the quality of schooling, and those kinds of issues. But you also have rights-based arguments about different claims that people have to move between countries, which really doesn't occur so much in the climate case. Now, Trevor pointed out that sociologists love 2 by 2 tables. We've made a major breakthrough here, because we had 3. Thank you. Thanks, Trevor. I don't know what I'd do without your interventions today. Essentially, we've got, so you'd think from a political point of view, well, monitoring would be quite simple, but actually there's been some useful work on this. So that they're both, I won't go into this in detail, but there's both a kind of question about, well, what kind of monitoring? So do you, what in the literature appears to be called police and patrol, that is, you have systems for monitoring these things continuously, and then you're supposed to correct if it's going over the trend. Or you have a fire alarm, which is essentially, oh shit, something's happened and you go and do something about it. These are rough different kinds of monitoring systems. And then the subject, you could monitor the inputs, like how much money is going into these things, or how many civil servants are working on it, or something like that. So you could look at the outputs. And I think particularly interesting for the defence case, where obviously you don't really want to have a war just in order to test the equipment, so you're not really so keen on the output side of it. You have a lot of focus on the process. Okay, so I'll actually say rather little about this, but it's framed in terms of a bunch of hypotheses about what focuses people's, what accounts for the different kinds of monitoring styles that occur in different kinds of areas. So there are some rather straightforward kind of claims from the political science literature, particularly about the public salience. So if it's in the Daily Mail a lot, you would expect the government, particularly a Conservative government, to have to worry about it and do some monitoring. But the things of which Christina is in some sense more interested in are these things down here. So what is it about the quality of the information that relates to the issue? So in defence, for example, because of secrecy, monitoring is often confounded by secrecy that so only certain people have the right to know about the performance. And then also for her, what she calls the organisational environment means which kinds of people hold one to account. So often in the climate case, you might think, well, it's primarily scientists who get to do this because nobody else has a kind of a certifiable technique for counting carbon dioxide concentrations. So we have some hypotheses about how these things work out. Now, I just want to finish. I've got a minute and a half left. Is that okay? So I've got just a tiny bit on so how this works in the climate change case in Britain. So essentially, we're interested both in emissions, so how much carbon dioxide gases or carbon dioxide equivalents we put out, but also the impacts of climate change. And as most of you will know, I suspect, the emissions issue these days is largely delegated to the Committee on Climate Change, a very sort of old-fashioned style advisory body, now chaired by Selwyn Gummer. David, I don't know how to say it. Devon. It's a place in Suffolk or Essex or somewhere. Conceal his name. So John, as we'll call him, has just taken over chairing this. So what does the CCC do? Well, this is from its own website, so what could be truer than that? The Climate Change Act establishes a target for the UK to reduce its emissions, and the CCC is there to check that. And the CCC tracks the latest emissions data against carbon budgets. So there's a sense, I've said here, tied to the mast, because in the famous case, Ulysses, he wants to hear the sirens, but he doesn't want to be swayed by them, so he gets his crew to tie him to the mast. And this has become a kind of popular analogy in social science literature. But in a sense, the government wants to be tied to the mast. So the government wants to say, well, somebody else is checking this out for us because there are so many temptations to deviate from the right path here. So the CCC is really there to make sure the government does what it says it's going to do. So there's then a question about what exactly that means. So there's partly a question of treaties. If you've got an international treaty that says you're going to do something, well, it's kind of shaming not to do it. But the government's also setting its own targets, and one of the things that the CCC has been very involved in recently is trying to put pressure on the government by saying, well, these are your targets, you pass those into law, but if you have a new dash for gas, it's going to be hard to meet your own targets. And then there's an issue about whether really you focus on emissions and consequences. Now there's an interesting problem, which the CCC is doing a little sort of gentle lobbying about, which is about what counts as the UK's emissions. So as, again, everybody here, I suspect, knows, there's an argument which goes something like this, that Britain and the rest of Western Europe looks like it's done very well because it's met their Kyoto targets, but essentially they've done that by decarbonising the economy and having everything made in China. And of course, and there's a further step in that argument which says, well, China's making these things with coal, and if only we kept making them here, we probably would have had less carbon impact because we would have made them using gas or something in our industry, or would have been nicer coal than the Chinese have. I'm not saying these are true claims, but that's how the argument goes. So the CCC gets very caught up in trying to tie the government to the mast, but there's a question about, well, what counts as the UK's emissions? Is it what often called the shadow emissions, the emissions which we implicitly use in the saucepans and motorbikes and cars and so on that we have, or is it just the emissions that come from our aisle? And if this point about emissions is rather centralised, the CCC is more or less in charge of that, the issue about effects is much more distributed. So you could think about, we've already talked about, well, I've already talked about climate change impacts in terms of impacts on agriculture, impacts on availability of drinking water, impacts on biodiversity, impacts on new disease patterns and so on. And those things are distributed over a very wide range of governmental and non-governmental agencies. And there isn't really, as yet, a very good sort of apparatus for tying those things together. And of course, the attribution of any of those can be contentious, as we saw with the floods last year. So people say, well, the floods were very probably a result of climate change, but you can't really know. So the question of what is an impact is also up for debate in a way that would be familiar from STS literature. And then finally, there's the issue, which is well known again, about the geographical and temporal separation of emissions. So that even if we stopped emitting, that doesn't mean we would not have any climate change impacts, because carbon would continue to enter the atmosphere and our sea levels would rise. And of course, temporal separation means that what we do now has consequences in the future, and even if we stopped emissions, there would still be built up consequences. So, conclusion. So I tried to sell you on the idea that the sociology of monitoring is an interesting thing. Eugénia's done a lot of work on this. I've done some, and we think it's cool. The Politics and Monitoring Project tries to bring together this kind of insight into some of the STS aspects of monitoring with a kind of political science interest in government targets and whether they and how they concentrate their monitoring effort. And then finally, I think there are lots of potentially interesting things to say about climate emissions and climate change in the UK, but we haven't got very far with that, and I'll come back and tell you next year. Thank you very much.